when the blue and white police car, its siren off but its lights flashing brightly, slowly turned onto Alder Street and stopped at Clara's old wooden fence. No one on the street was particularly surprised. On the contrary, they had been anticipating this moment for weeks. Most of all, Dennis, her neighbor across the street, was looking forward to it. On that warm June afternoon, he stood on his immaculately washed porch, his arms crossed triumphantly across his chest. A smug grin played across his face, the look of a man who had finally achieved his goal. Dennis hated Clara. More precisely, he hated anything that disturbed the perfect, sterile order of his little suburban paradise. His own lawn resembled a green billiard baize. Not a single dandelion, not a single blade of grass straying from the strictly prescribed 2-inch height. He spent thousands of dollars on chemicals, automatic sprinklers, and professional landscapers. Clara, he firmly believed, had turned her property into a veritable dump, what she buried in the ground right under his windows. Dennis openly called an environmental hazard and a disgrace to the entire neighborhood. The police officers, treading heavily on the asphalt, headed toward Clara's gate. Dennis watched them go, mentally celebrating his victory. He was certain that his 13th call to the station would finally have an effect. However, neither Dennis nor the patrol officers themselves could have guessed at that moment that this call would take them completely by surprise, and that what they would see beyond Clara's fence would leave the experienced officers speechless. Before we continue the story about a silent, fence-to-fence war, human stubbornness, and the incredible power of nature, please take a second to like and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. This really helps our channel grow and tell you new amazing stories. Clara moved to the suburb 3 years ago after finding herself completely alone. Her modest one-story house was in need of repair, and the surrounding property had stood abandoned for years. The soil was heavy, clay, and depleted, making even the most undemanding weeds reluctant to grow. Clara simply didn't have the money to properly landscape the yard. She spent almost all of her meager savings on keeping the house habitable. Dennis began pressuring her from the very first day. He regularly sent her excerpts from the Homeowners Association rules, hinting that the unkempt appearance of her property was lowering the market value of his own, and persistently recommended that she hire his crew of workers to roll the entire yard into a neat green turf. Clara merely smiled politely in response, saying she had her own plan, which would take time. It all began in late autumn, when a large local garden nursery on the outskirts of town announced its closure and bankruptcy. On their last day of operation, they held a huge sale, but even with a 90% discount, most of the plants remained unsold. The nursery owners simply hauled the remaining inventory to the backyard, dumping it in a huge pile near the dumpsters for later disposal. Clara discovered this by chance while driving past in her old, battered pickup truck. She rounded the corner of the building and saw mountains of black plastic pots and enormous mounds of soil. These mounds contained hundreds of perennial flower rhizomes, elite varieties of large-leaf hydrangea and tree peonies. They were painful to look at. They were dry, shriveled, and covered in places with black rot and mold from improper storage. Any professional gardener would have said they were completely worthless, dead organic waste that would never sprout again. But Clara saw something else in that pile. She recalled an old notebook belonging to her grandmother, who had lived her entire life in the countryside and could work miracles with the most hopeless plants. Clara approached the nursery manager, who was just overseeing the garbage loading, and asked if she could take the bags of roots. He just looked at her in surprise, laughed, and waved his hand, saying she was saving him from having to pay for waste removal. Clara spent the entire evening hauling these heavy, dirty bags into the back of her pickup. When she finally arrived home, it was already dark. Dennis, keeping watch at the window as usual, noticed her old car, sagging heavily on its springs, pull into the yard. In the light of the streetlight, he saw Clara pulling out huge bags, from which black dust was pouring out, along with strange, twisted objects resembling dried driftwood. The next morning, Dennis went out to the fence to get a closer look. Clara had laid out her trophies right on the grass. It was truly a peculiar sight. Hundreds of blackened, half-rotted rhizomes, emanating the distinctive smell of dampness and rotting leaves. Dennis couldn't resist walking up to the fence and, loudly enough for the other neighbors to hear, asking why she had brought this rotting junk onto her property. He declared that these rotten trees would attract rats from all over the neighborhood and become a breeding ground for fungus that would ruin his perfect lawn. Clara calmly replied that it was a future garden that just needed a little help. Dennis merely chuckled sarcastically, shook his head, and loudly declared that some people's stupidity knew no bounds, and that all that trash would produce was toadstools. But Clara ignored the ridicule. She set about a task that, from the outside, seemed utterly insane to Dennis. Instead of simply digging holes and planting roots, she began preparing the soil using an old family method, which Dennis considered the final proof of her madness. She brought several bags of regular charcoal and bone meal. For several weeks, Clara dug deep into the clay soil of her plot, mixing it with charcoal, sand, and decayed leaves she collected in the forest. She created what is called living soil in permaculture. The charcoal acted as a natural antiseptic and sponge. It absorbed excess moisture, preventing further decay of already damaged roots, and then gradually released it to the plants during droughts. The bone meal provided long-term phosphorus, essential for the development of a strong root system. Clara carefully examined each rhizome. She carefully trimmed away the rotted areas with sharp pruning shears, cutting them down to living, healthy tissue, treating the cuts with crushed charcoal, and soaking them in a special organic solution, the recipe for which her grandmother had kept. It was long, dirty, and grueling work. Her hands were covered in dirt. Her clothes smelled of fire and humus, but quiet, stubborn light burned in her eyes. Dennis watched this every day. Everything irritated him. The sight of the dug-up black earth, the sacks of coal, and even Clara herself, kneeling in the mud for hours. He began filing complaints with the local homeowners association and the city inspectorate. In his complaints, he claimed that Clara was setting up an unauthorized compost bin on the property, violating health regulations, and ruining the aesthetics of the street. Soon, Clara's first inspector arrived. He was an elderly man named Harwell, who had witnessed all sorts of neighborly squabbles in his lifetime. He carefully inspected Clara's property, checking the bags of coal and bone meal. Dennis stood by his fence, expecting the inspector to immediately issue Clara a hefty fine and force her to haul all this garbage to the city dump. But Harwell, to Dennis's deep disappointment, found no violations. He had a keen understanding of agriculture and immediately realized that Clara wasn't littering the property, but rather was conducting thorough, effective soil reclamation. He simply wished her luck, got into his car, and drove away. This infuriated Dennis. He realized that the official channels through the association weren't working as quickly as he would have liked, and he decided to launch his own psychological warfare. Every time Clara stepped into the yard, Dennis would turn on his powerful lawnmower, sending a stream of clippings and dust toward her fence. He would loudly comment on her every move, predicting the utter failure of her plan. Over time, his ridicule was joined by some of the other neighbors, who were also obsessed with neat, standard-issue lawns and couldn't understand why Clara had turned her yard into a black, plowed field. By early winter, Clara had finished planting. All hundreds of rescued hydrangea and peony roots were carefully laid in the ground along the fence dividing her property from Dennis's, as well as around the entire perimeter of her front garden. She covered the plantings with a thick layer of straw and wood chips to protect them from the coming January frosts. From that moment on, her yard looked like a completely empty expanse covered in gray straw. Dennis gloated all winter, declaring to all their friends that Clara had simply wasted her time and money, and that this mound of shame would finally rot away in the spring. The winter was harsh and snowless. The ground froze to a great depth, and Dennis proudly noted that even his vaunted lawn suffered frost damage in places, despite expensive protective agents. He was absolutely certain that Clara's damaged roots, deprived of professional greenhouse care, had no chance of survival in this frozen clay. When spring arrived and the first ice melted, Dennis redoubled his efforts to restore his lawn. He seeded new grass, applied liquid nitrogen fertilizer, and hired aerators. His plot once again shone with a perfect, almost artificial green. Meanwhile, Clara's plot remained silent. The straw had darkened with moisture, and there were no signs of life. Dennis was triumphant. Passing her house, he would mutter loudly through his teeth, "I told you so. It's just a pile of rot." Clara didn't respond to provocations. She simply waited. She knew the old methods worked slowly, but surely. The charcoal held heat around the roots in winter, preventing them from turning to ice, and in the spring it gradually began to warm the soil, activating dormant buds. And then, in mid-May, something happened that Dennis never expected. One day, when the sun began to really warm, the first shoots began to poke through the dark straw in Clara's garden. They didn't look like the usual puny grass. These were powerful, thick, burgundy-green shoots of peonies and juicy, bright green hydrangea shoots. They appeared by the hundreds, as if on cue. Clara went out into the garden every day, carefully freeing the young shoots from the remnants of their winter shelter. The speed with which these plants developed was astonishing. The depleted clay, thanks to the charcoal and bone meal, transformed into a rich, loose substrate, maintaining an ideal moisture balance. The roots, which the nursery had considered dead, developed colossal underground strength during the several months of winter dormancy. They greedily absorbed the spring warmth and nutrients. By early June, Clara's property had changed beyond recognition. Instead of a dreary gray wasteland, a thick, mighty wall of emerald leaves rose up. The peonies were the first to bloom. They were huge, tarry heads of white, soft pink, and deep burgundy. Their fragrance was so strong and pleasant that it overpowered the smell of the chemicals Dennis incessantly sprayed on the side of the street. Passers-by began to slow their pace near Clara's house to admire this unexpected beauty. But the greatest miracle was yet to come. The hydrangeas that Clara had planted in a dense strip along the border with Dennis began to gain strength. These weren't ordinary garden bushes, but elite remontant varieties of large-leaved hydrangea, which, with proper care, can grow to gigantic proportions. And thanks to the special soil composition Clara had created with her own hands, something incredible happened. As is well known, the color of hydrangeas is directly dependent on the acidity of the soil and the presence of certain elements, particularly aluminum. Charcoal, combined with the natural acidity of the local clay and Clara's secret organic additives, created the ideal conditions for the development of the rarest and most sought-after shade. The buds that began to open in mid-June weren't just a faded pink or white. They began to turn a fantastic, deep, almost luminous neon blue and ultramarine. The bushes grew at an astonishing rate, adding several inches a week. By the end of June, they had formed a solid, living, impenetrable wall. They were already over 2.5 meters tall and still growing. Enormous, heavy blooms, the size of a good-sized soccer ball, completely covered Clara's old wooden fence and began to spill over onto Dennis's side of the fence. For Dennis, this was the last straw. This lush, vibrant, living wall completely destroyed his vision of a minimalist, formal landscape. Furthermore, the neon blue hydrangea blooms cast a shadow on the edge of his perfect lawn, slowing the grass there. But most of all, the wall completely blocked his view. He no longer had any control over what was happening in his neighbor's garden, and he felt resentful. His authority as the street's premier gardener was completely shattered. People no longer looked at his perfect, yet dull, green carpet. All eyes were on Clara's incredible, fairy tale-like garden. It was then that Dennis decided to take the drastic step. He realized that regular inspectors wouldn't help him, so he decided to resort to outright deception. He called the police and, in a worried, panicked voice, reported that his neighbor had created a dangerous plantation of unknown, possibly poisonous plants on her property. He claimed that her yard emitted a suffocating odor. Her enormous bushes were blocking the roadway, creating a dangerous situation for cars, and the roots of these gigantic plants were destroying underground utilities and the foundation of his own home. He demanded immediate law enforcement intervention to stop this environmental crime. And so, a police cruiser pulled up outside Clara's house. The officers, called to a report of an illegal plantation and a threat to public safety, exited the car. Dennis, beaming with anticipation of the coming reprisal, quickly descended from his veranda and ran toward the officers, gesturing and pointing toward Clara's yard as he ran. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," Dennis shouted, trying to be heard by all the neighbors who had already begun to emerge from their homes. "This is simply unbearable. She brought tons of rotten garbage from the landfill here, buried it all, and now some kind of mutants have grown here. They're shading my property, destroy my fence, and I'm sure they're emitting toxic fumes." Look at these unnatural blue flowers. This doesn't happen in nature. It's clearly chemicals or something worse. Find her and make her cut it all down." The senior officer, a middle-aged man with a tired face named Roy, listened attentively to Dennis's stream of complaints, but said nothing. He and his partner turned and headed for Clara's gate. At that moment, Clara stepped out onto the porch of her house. She was wearing simple work jeans, an old shirt, and gardening gloves. She held a watering can in her hands. She looked calmly at the approaching police officers and nodded welcomingly. "Good afternoon, officers," Clara said quietly. "How can I help you?" "Hello, ma'am," Officer Roy replied, removing his sunglasses. "We received a complaint from your neighbor. He claims your plantings are a public safety hazard, blocking visibility, and posing a health hazard due to use of unknown chemicals. We're obligated to investigate this information." Clara smiled slightly and gestured for the officers to enter her courtyard. "Please, come in. You can explore every corner here. I don't use any chemicals, just charcoal, bone meal, and plain water." The officers stepped through the gate, and at that moment their faces changed. It was as if they had entered another world. Before them towered an incredible living wall of thousands of gigantic neon blue hydrangea blossoms. They were so dense and luscious that they seemed straight out of a science fiction painting. The sun's rays, filtering to the petals, created a soft, magical glow. The air in the garden was surprisingly fresh, filled with a subtle scent of peonies and morning dew. Officer Roy, who had seen his share of criminal dens, filthy dumps, and neglected yards over the years, simply froze in place. His partner, a young man, couldn't help but whistle softly in surprise. He reached out and carefully touched one of the enormous blue spheres. "Ma'am," Officer Roy said slowly, looking around, "your neighbor claimed this was a dumping ground for rotten garbage and a source of toxic fumes. But this is the most beautiful place I've seen in our county in the last 20 years. Dennis, who was standing by the gate, craning his neck to hear the conversation, shouted, "Officer, are you going to write her a citation? Look, those branches are climbing onto my side. That's trespassing." Officer Roy turned slowly to face Dennis. His expression became stern. He walked up to the gate and looked down at his crouching neighbor. "Mr. Dennis," the policeman said firmly, "I recommend you stop wasting our time with false alarms. These plants are on Miss Clara's property. They're not blocking the roadway, and they're not on municipal land. This is a private garden. And if you're bothered by the 2 branches hanging over your fence, you have the legal right to carefully trim them off your side. But if you call the station again with tales of toxic mutants and poisonous plantations, we'll be forced to issue you a citation for false alarm." Dennis stood there, his mouth hanging open, his face first flushed, then turned pale gray with humiliation. He glanced from the police to Clara, unsure what to say. The neighbors, watching from their own yards, began to laugh openly and whisper among themselves. Dennis's victory had turned into complete, crushing, and public disgrace. Officer Roy turned back to Clara. His stern gaze instantly softened. "You know, Miss Clara, my wife's birthday is coming up soon. She loves flowers, but nothing really grows in our garden because of this awful local clay. Could you tell me where I can buy some stunning blue hydrangeas? I've never seen anything like them." Clara smiled warmly, walked deeper into the garden, and returned a minute later with a neatly cut, enormous bouquet of neon blue hydrangeas and several snow-white peonies. She handed them to the officer. "Take this for your wife, officer," she said, "and you'll need to buy them. These are the same roots our city nursery dumped last fall. Everyone thought they were dead trash. The secret isn't in the plants themselves, but in how you prepare the soil for them. If you like, I can write down a recipe for your wife for preparing the soil using ordinary charcoal. It will bring even the most hopeless root back to life." Officer Roy gratefully accepted the bouquet, holding it carefully in his hands as if it were his greatest treasure. "You performed a true miracle, ma'am. Thank you. And don't worry, Mr. Dennis won't bother you again. I'll see to it personally." The police officers got into their car and drove away slowly, leaving Dennis standing on his immaculate, but now seemingly lifeless, lawn. He turned and quickly walked into his house, slamming the door loudly. From that day on, he never spoke to Clara again and tried not to glance at her property. which was now safely hidden from his view by a majestic, 3-meter-high wall of fresh flowers. But the story didn't end there. Clara's neon blue wall became a real sensation. People from all over the city began flocking to Alder Street, simply to take photos with this natural wonder. Soon, the new owner of the bankrupt nursery learned of this, bought the premises of the previous owners, and tried to rebuild the business. One evening, an expensive black car pulled up outside Clara's house. A man in a business suit named Roy Powell emerged. He stood by the fence for a long time, mesmerized by the blue flowers glowing in the twilight. Then he knocked on Clara's door. When she opened the door, he introduced himself and said, "Miss Clara, I manage a new garden center. My agronomists have been trying for months to achieve that pure, deep blue hue in hydrangeas. But in our greenhouses, we only get faded, muddy colors." When I was told that someone had grown a masterpiece from roots the previous owners had thrown in the trash, I couldn't believe it. But now I see it with my own eyes. It's phenomenal. Roy Powell offered Clara an official partnership. He offered her a contract whereby her garden will become the official demonstration site for his nursery. Furthermore, he hired Clara as his chief consultant on complex soil remediation. He allocated her a budget to create a unique, signature line of organic substrates based on charcoal and bone meal, using her grandmother's recipe, which is now sold in garden centers across the state under her name. Clara, who recently struggled to make ends meet while renovating her old house, has now become a respected and wealthy expert in her field. Her old pickup truck has been replaced by a new, comfortable car, and her house has been transformed. But the garden itself remains the same, just as cozy, vibrant, and free. Today, driving down Alder Street, it's impossible not to notice this house. It's immersed in greenery and flowers. Every spring and summer, a 3-meter-high living wall of neon blue hydrangeas reminds all residents of the town that what most consider useless trash and rotten junk can, in the hands of someone with patience, knowledge, and a kind heart, be transformed into a true miracle, one that renders all ridicule and envy powerless.